Thank you, Rena. Welcome back from tea, everyone. My name is Jess Holbrook. You might remember me from introducing booklets earlier. And I am very happy to welcome Matt Webb here. So let me do the little rundown and embarrass him a bit. So Matt is an accomplished designer, company founder and leader, and large company and startup advisor. He founded and was CEO of the design agency Berg from 2009 to 2015. After that, he was the managing director of RGA's Ventures Accelerator program in London, establishing their presence in the UK. In this role, he did everything from lead the group strategy to startup sourcing to building investment cases for funding to coordinating deals and negotiations, all while coaching and advising a number of startups in the area. In this capacity, he really got a unique and wide view into the UK's startup scene, especially with IoT or Internet of Things startups. Most recently, he founded Job Garden, connecting top talent in the UK with startups who need it. And he also runs the strategy and innovation consultancy MWIE Limited. So please help me in welcoming Matt to the stage. So, we're late in the afternoon. We need something to kind of wake people up. And, we know that we heard that Pear's nice and we're all, kind people, but we're not afraid to ask the hard-hitting questions. So, Matt, I want to start with the topic that's on everyone's mind, which are light bulbs.
That was not what you said you were. No, we were talking about light bulbs.
Yeah, we were talking about light bulbs.
This is our own fault, I think.
Yes.
So the way we started talking about this was I've been working a lot with Internet of Things companies for the last few years, and by doing this accelerator program, I've kind of looked at I think for each program maybe 400 companies, met a few dozen in person, and my assumption was I was going to see loads of kind of smart home companies. That's kind of what we think of as Internet of Things, right? And I did not. Right? Business IoT, I saw loads of. So it's a really interesting thing, business IoT, bringing the physical world into the domain of the internet. I met companies like, there's a great one called Winnow, which deals with commercial food waste. So they use computer vision to identify meals that are sent back from restaurants in the kitchens to identify where the waste is coming from and what to be done about it. They reduce waste by about 50%. They're rolling out at IKEA. Great company. Consumer IoT, smart home, the Star Trek future, right? That hasn't happened, which is where we get to light bulbs.
Right.
And the question is, why not? Right? It's a bit of a damp squib. When I kind of think about my smart home thing at home, it's all the centralized voice assistant. There's a device somewhere, and you have to kind of go, living room, corner lamp, turn on, right?
Right.
Which is a terrible user experience.
It's kind of like voice interface command line, right?
It's exactly like that.
It's perfect specification of the thing I want.
And it's it's hostile to kids and to people who visit your house and to people who don't share the same language. But it's bad, right?
Yep.
So I saw these companies and I started complaining about the state of light bulbs. And people were like, well, what would be an alternative, right? How else would we do it?
Right.
And this is kind of where it connects with the AI thing, because I started going well, what about an AI-powered light bulb which doesn't need any kind of network connection at all? Because what would be the best user experience, right? Mm-hmm. It would be just to point at the light and go on, or to glance at it and go on. And it turns out, psychologically, glance detection is one of the earliest things we learn how to do as babies, because it's really easy. The whites of your eyes make it really easy to do that kind of pattern detection. And then you dig into it a bit more, and it turns out that a single chip with a compiled model on it can run for just to detect one or two wake words. It's super, super low powered. And a simple camera, one of those chips. Turns out the microphone is the most power intensive thing, but you kind of add them together. And you could probably do most of it through energy harvesting, zero power, just look at the light, just say on. Just point at it, just say on. And so why don't we have that world, the counterfactual?
Right, yeah.
Why don't we have that world? And this is where I have to guess a bit, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you know, you should tell us, but.
My guess is that like everyone kind of saw the internet and network effects, and they saw IoT, and they were like, we can do that again.
Yeah.
Right? Like they wanted to go for they wanted to grab the entire ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
And so they ended up kind of making a really sucky UI,
Mm-hmm.
but one that would have like get people to buy into an ecosystem and let them control the entire home.
Right. Why? Yeah. I mean, we were talking about this, and you know, it feels like you just articulated, you know, something that is very user experience centered, right? Something that, like, you say, yep, this is a thing I can imagine using. This would make everyone happy. And so, in your experience interacting with all these different companies, you know, why not make that choice? What is this, you know, adherence or this drive for the platform, or the, you know, we kind of talked about things like strategy taxes and this, you know, why not make that decision? There's a lot of user experience people in the crowd too that would, you know, we're often baffled by this. Why not just make this this great experience versus going for applying, I guess, that previous paradigm's model to this one?
The kind of the work on the user experience first. It's interesting, isn't it? I think the strategy tax phrase is interesting. It's a phrase from, I think, Ben Thompson, I think, is where I first heard it from, but it's the idea that sometimes the product quality suffers at the expense of corporate goals. Mm-hmm. So you make some kind of compromise about like what a product is like to use in order that some kind of strategic need can be fulfilled. And I think the problem is that isn't, when you look at it, the way that product development kind of happens, right? Like the reward function of product is the market. Mm-hmm. And if the thing doesn't sell, it's never going to get to that point where it's going to develop. Mm-hmm. I would love to figure out how to reverse these things.
Yeah, there's a bit of, I mean, this is kind of the age of platforms too, right? It's like as soon as there are dominant platforms, everybody wants to be the next dominant platform, and is almost, you see almost, that competition to be a platform of some kind versus a really great experience on an existing platform, or using that to actually to move up.
Yeah, and it's weird, isn't it? Because framing it like that sounds like the two are opposed. Right? Mm-hmm. Either you have a great product, or you have this great kind of platform where you own everything. And I don't think that's really the case. Because let's kind of imagine that the future we did go after was like a AI-powered light bulb that doesn't connect to the network with a great user experience, and just get that out into the world and kind of see where that goes. You could kind of imagine a future to that where you say, well, really what we've done now is we've invented a zero-power button that can be pushed from a distance, like, you know, E.T. with really long fingers. You know, it's a component with superpowers.
Right.
And then you can sell that into the component supply chain, and every physical product ends up with this thing.
Right.
And so now it's just as big a picture, but it was kind of harder to imagine. And I think this is the power of where design comes in, right? Like speculative product invention can help us invent new products, prototype them, and paint pictures of these future in order to kind of bring it to life for leadership, for strategy people, for the people who make these kind of platform decisions, in a way that they maybe couldn't have appreciated so far.
Yeah, absolutely. We were talking about, you know, specular design, prototyping, ways of examining the future. You know, some people call it practicing the future, and I think that was something that you know, was our experience, and people in the audience was maybe experiences. As these new technologies come online, they're very hard to prototype in a lot of ways. They're very hard to experience until they're working, and they're very hard to understand the consequences of them at scale. So you might be able to understand them at an individual level, but it's very hard to understand them at a broader level. And so, you know, in some circles, there's been a bit of a rise of interest in speculative design again. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk a bit, you know, about your experience at RGA or even at Berg, about how you used prototypes, speculative design, because to me these are rhyming with boundary objects, with better conversations, with some of the themes that we've been talking about today.
So more recently I've used a kind of a speculative product invention approach with Google, a couple of summer projects with the Android group, and the process kind of followed with that, getting into details of what it was to explore an area and create prototypes which surface you know, some kind of new opportunity nascent in the technology. But the purpose of doing the prototype is it does act as this kind of very real object, which means that platform engineers and the people making the prioritization decisions and designers and marketers can all have these single objects to stand around and critique. Because if you don't have those things, people can be having conversations where they think they're talking about the same thing, but they're actually talking about completely separate things entirely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting, I think, too, of how it's extending from, the quick sketch or the mock-up to, how do you mock up a complex system or a complex system over time or a societal change. And speculative design seems to be one of the methods to actually do that. I was thinking, too, of everyone you just named, thinking about Raghu. I lost him in the crowd. Was kind of, oh, hey. Well, I was kind of talking, I thought it was really interesting earlier, his insights about bringing even more people into the conversation, like policymakers, like admins, like these decision makers, and things like a policy lab. And I was wondering, did in your experience, did you ever have experience bringing like those people into those conversations or creating, a boundary object or a prototype or something that was able to widen that circle even more, or was it focused on the product groups?
So my interaction policy has been fairly limited and mostly focused on market stimulus. So one of the things was looking at some years ago was how to get the IoT ecosystem stimulated in the UK, how to kind of grow it. But a lot of that worked by looking at case studies of existing companies and how they were already kind of operating in the country, because that was, again, by kind of using real examples, you can get multiple different groups to think about it simultaneously. But I think it's interesting thinking about kind of boundary objects or prototypes as ways of getting different groups to talk, because this is a different language than transparency, right? When we were talking about transparency earlier, we were talking about kind of how to make these complex systems understood. But we don't just want to understand them, right? We want to co-develop them. We want we want small social groups to kind of go, almost to be able to read the weather of these objects, go like, oh, this system for picking up how many bugs there are on the farm, it's not working too well with that particular type of bug. Or it's not working so well today, or this one can be trusted more. So maybe we don't need to be thinking about transparency with these objects, we need to be talking about the ability to be reasoned with. How do we have handles on these things? How do we give names to it?
Yeah, I think that's really great. That's connecting for me with a point Michael made and a point David made around, the explanation lanterns, or an explanation is not a literal thing you say, but maybe it's a way to have a more productive conversation or discussion. Is it giving everybody essentially the tools that you can have that kind of hard to define better conversation about something.
And I think the words we use for things are incredibly important. Like this is maybe veering horrifically off topic.
Let's
now.
do it.
But, okay.
Let's do it.
It's
that time of day, everybody.
So I have a hobby interest in like the history of computing and cybernetics.
I mean, lots of people do.
Because why not? There's this great book that I recommend you read if you're interested in this, called From Newspeak to Cyberspeak, which is a history of Soviet cybernetics. Because the vision of cybernetics, a kind of a holistic society, a planned economy, obviously very appealing to the Soviets at that time. So they were translating a lot of the papers coming out of the US into Russian. But because of a focus on materialism, a lot of the words in these papers to do with early computing, words like learning, words like memory, adapting, were edited out because those weren't material. Those were words that belonged to humans, right, or at best biology, and not to machines. The argument in From Newspeak to Cyberspeak is this limited the way Soviets imagined computers. So while the Americans came up, and Engelbart came up with augmenting human intellect, computers for creativity, the PC, the Soviets were stuck in imagining computers just as fast as calculators. Right. They could only imagine using them for ballistics calculations.
Right.
So I think that's another role for design, right, is to have the right words for things.
Yeah, I think that's, we were talking a little bit about that. I've been trying to kind of process this because then you kind of get into almost this loop of, well, are the terms that we're using limiting how we're seeing the application of it? I kind of connect this with some of the ideas of bringing more people in, because sometimes you'll bring somebody in. I was talking earlier and talking about in linguistics, and you might have a separation between semantics and pragmatics around the meaning of a word in linguistics. And for me, for a social science background, I'm like, oh yeah, we have words for that too, of whether something can kind of stand alone or depends on its context, but we just use slightly different terminology. And I wonder about that, about like how much we need to be investing in essentially learning each other's languages, because it may unlock other possible futures we can see.
Right. And I think another really great way of doing it is to use art, right? So it was so heartening to kind of see what's happening with Magenta earlier, is that with art you can appreciate things on a more sensory level, and artists are able to kind of get to the heart of things without going through the linguistic filters, which means that we can only see the words we've attached to things. And there are lots of examples from that, with kind of Bell Labs or Xerox PARC using kind of artists embedded next to the engineers to invent things such as computer animation.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, this is something that at a lot of the major companies too. There's some kind of pairing of artists and AI or artists and machine intelligence. Google has one, Microsoft has one. I'm sure there's multiple others I'm missing. It's a fascinating pairing of what is that? Is it the fact that there are different? I mean, I like that you're almost kind of transcending the idea of different words, where you were saying sensory, right? You were saying like actually, does it allow you to access different possibilities because it actually, in a lot of sense, separates from a clear spoken or verbal description.
Right. So we bypass the linguistic system, and I think the kind of the in-residence program is, I noticed that the kind of the writer in residence kind of approach is a kind of a thing that works. Like one of my side projects over the last couple of years is I've been running a bookshop in an internet-connected vending machine, and taking it on tour around different locations.
Can you describe that a bit? Wait, I'm just so verbal. I can't imagine it in my. Yeah, can you explain it a bit more?
The kind of the big vending machines you get at like municipal swimming pools to like buy crisps. Sweets, right?
I love them. Yeah.
Yeah. So I got one of those off eBay.
Okay.
And
how much, if you don't ask me?
Oh, it was cheap, like £100 or something.
Oh, wow.
Right.
All right.
And then
we
connected it to the internet.
All right.
Which is hard, right? Because the internals of vending machines, they work a bit like USB, so it's an internal protocol. But it was defined by Coca-Cola Japan in 1975 in order to have vendor optionality between the people who do the coin change in the machine. Which means for technical people here, they'll get this. Japanese has weird characters, longer characters, so there are 9-bit bytes. So 9-bit bytes are kind of unheard of in modern computing. But vending machines are impossible to interface with. Anyway, so we built this interface. I joined the Booksellers Association, and I would take this machine and stock it full of books recommended by people in the building.
Okay.
And buy the books, restock it every week, and it would tweet when it sold a book. And, it could kind of do instrumented retail the same way you do on Amazon, but in real life. Anyway, it weighed 270 kilograms. It was a really impractical hobby. How did we start on this?
I just took a note. We're going to call this From Light Bulbs to Vending Machines when we put it online.
So I took it on tour, right? It was in actually Google's campus location in Shoreditch for a few months, and we called it a machine in residence. So its job was to go around different locations to be a machine in residence, and it would get people thinking that we didn't need this division between online, e-com, and real-life retail, that we could have feedback loops and recommendations in this human aspect and this physical aspect, but connected to the internet, there didn't need to be this kind of division. So it had this kind of non-verbal, in-residence thing too. Also, I love books.
Yeah, they're, mostly about cybernetics in the Soviet Union, but what were some of the, this is just way more fascinating than the other question I had. What were some of the reactions to this? Maybe tie it back a bit, like what do you think, what did you learn from doing this, other than the weight and cost of vending machines online?
I learned that vending machines get really hot inside when you turn the fridge off, because they're basically refrigeration units, which means that all the adhesive smell and the shelf talkers, the recommendation cards fall off. So that's a very unpractical thing.
Yes.
I learned. The more practical thing is I learned that this was done before. So the origin of paperback books is not just they were small and paperback, it's that they were made to be sold along magazine supply chains in railway stations, in wire racks. So the real revolution of paperback books in the 1930s, I think, both in the UK and the US, was to use different distribution models to take interesting books to where people were instead of dusty bookshops. And I think about that a lot, right? Because it says to me that it's not enough to kind of invent something new. You have to make concessions to the market and go to where people are purchasing things, get in front of them. So it's never a kind of do we have engagement or do we act pure? There's always some kind of combination of both.
Gotcha. I think that's as good a place as any to end. Thank you very much, Matt Webb, everybody.
Thank you.